The forgotten sister whispered, "I heard you needed a bride." The cold Duke smirked. "Maybe you." In the great house of Ashworth, there were two daughters. One was loved by everyone who saw her. The other was barely noticed at all. The elder daughter, Seraphine, had golden hair and a laugh that filled every room she entered. From the time she was a little girl, people had told her she was special. Her mother dressed her in the finest gowns. Her father took her to every ball, every dinner, every gathering where important people could see her and remember her name. She grew up believing, quite naturally, that the world existed to admire her. The younger daughter, Elira, was different. She was quiet. She liked books more than parties. She noticed things other people missed. The way a candle flickered before it went out. The way a servant's hands shook when they were tired. The way her sister's smile changed depending on who was watching. But nobody noticed Elira noticing. In her own home, she had become something like furniture. Useful, present, but never truly seen. It had not always been this way. When she was very small, her mother had held her just as often as she held Seraphine. But as the girls grew older, and it became clear that Seraphine was the kind of beautiful that made men stop talking mid-sentence, the family's attention shifted entirely. Every conversation at dinner became about Seraphine's future. Every letter that arrived was addressed, in spirit if not on paper, to Seraphine. Elira learned to eat her meals quietly and slip away before anyone thought to ask her opinion on anything. She remembered, still, the year she turned 12. Their mother had planned an enormous birthday celebration for Seraphine that same season, since the two girls' birthdays fell only a week apart, and it had simply seemed easier, their mother said, to combine the two occasions into one grand party. Elira had spent weeks looking forward to it, imagining her own small moment among the celebration, perhaps a single toast, a single mention of her name. When the day came, she stood at the edge of the ballroom in a dress that had once belonged to Seraphine, watching guest after guest approach her sister with gifts and warm wishes, while she herself received polite nods and quick, distracted smiles. Nobody sang for her. Nobody remembered until the very end of the evening that it had ever been her birthday at all. She had gone up to her room before the last guests left, changed out of the borrowed dress, and told herself, quite firmly, that she did not mind. She had told herself that so many times over the years that she had almost come to believe it. She did not resent her sister for this, not exactly. It was not Seraphine's fault that she had been born first, or that she had inherited their mother's striking eyes and their father's easy charm. But there were nights when Elira lay awake and wondered what it would feel like to walk into a room and have someone's eyes light up simply because she had arrived. She had never known that feeling. She was not sure she ever would. The town they lived in was small but proud, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where marriages were often more about family standing than about love. It was in this town that whispers began to spread about a duke. His name was Cassian Thorne, and he was, by every account, a difficult man. He was young for a duke, having inherited his title earlier than expected after a family tragedy that people spoke of only in hushed voices. He was known to be sharp-tongued, distant, and utterly unmoved by the usual games of courtship. Women who tried to charm him left his presence looking faintly wounded, as though they had walked into a closed door in the dark. He rarely smiled. He rarely explained himself. And he had, for years, shown no interest whatsoever in marriage. That was, until a letter arrived from his family's lawyers. The details were complicated, the kind of legal matter that involved old family land, a will written by a stubborn grandfather, and a deadline that could not be moved. In short, if the Duke did not marry within a matter of months, a large portion of his inheritance, including the estate that had belonged to his family for 4 generations, would pass to a distant cousin he despised. It was not romance that pushed him toward marriage. It was necessity. News like this could not stay quiet for long, not in a town so hungry for gossip. Within weeks, every family with an unmarried daughter began finding reasons to visit the Thorne estate, or to invite the Duke to dinner, or to simply appear wherever he happened to be. Mothers polished their daughters like silverware. Fathers rehearsed clever things to say about crops and politics, hoping to catch the Duke's attention. The Ashworth family was no different. Elira's mother had barely finished reading the news in the local paper before she was already planning which of Seraphine's gowns would make the best impression. It did not occur to her, not even for a moment, to consider Elira for the match. Why would it? Seraphine was the beautiful one. Seraphine was the one men wanted. If any Ashworth daughter was going to become a duchess, of course it would be her. Elira, for her part, felt nothing when she heard the news. Why should she? It had nothing to do with her. She continued her quiet days, reading in the corner of the library, tending to the garden that nobody else in the family cared for, listening to her mother's excited chatter about the Duke as though it were the weather report, present, but not something that touched her directly. The invitation came sooner than anyone expected. A family friend who knew the Duke's aunt had arranged a small gathering, a sort of informal evening where a handful of eligible families could be introduced to him without the pressure of a full ball. It was, everyone understood, an audition. The Ashworth household spent 3 days preparing. Seraphine had 3 different gowns laid out, unable to decide which made her look the most radiant. Their mother fussed over her hair, her jewelry, the exact tilt of her chin when she curtsied. Elira, meanwhile, was handed a plain gray dress that had been mended twice and told, almost as an afterthought, that she could come along if she wished, though she would likely be more comfortable staying home. She almost did stay home. But something, perhaps simple curiosity, perhaps a small and stubborn part of her that refused to be entirely erased, made her decide to go. The evening was held in a grand drawing room, lit by dozens of candles, the kind of room where every surface gleamed and every guest seemed to be performing a role they had rehearsed for years. Elira stood near the back, half hidden by a large potted plant, watching as her sister moved through the crowd like a queen greeting her subjects. And then the Duke arrived. He was tall, with dark hair and an expression that gave away nothing at all. He moved through the room the way a man moves through a place he has no interest in being. He greeted people with the minimum courtesy required and no more. When Seraphine was introduced to him, she performed her very best curtsy, tilted her chin at precisely the angle she had practiced, and offered him a smile that had, by her own account, never once failed to charm a man. The Duke looked at her for exactly as long as politeness demanded, said something brief and forgettable, and turned away. Seraphine was stunned. She was not used to being turned away from. She spent the rest of the evening trying again and again to recapture his attention, growing more desperate and more brittle with each failed attempt, until finally, in a moment of wounded pride, she said something cutting about the Duke's reputation within earshot of several guests. Something about how a man with no warmth in his heart could hardly expect warmth in return, and that perhaps he would do better marrying his ledgers, since numbers seemed to be the only thing he cared for. The room went quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. The Duke did not react the way anyone expected. He did not look embarrassed, or angry, or hurt. His face remained as still as stone, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes. Something that might have been amusement, or might have been the particular tiredness of a man who has heard cruel words dressed up as clever ones many times before. It was in that silence that Elira, without entirely meaning to, stepped forward. She had not planned to speak. She had not planned to be noticed at all. But watching her sister humiliate herself, and watching the Duke stand there absorbing the insult with such quiet dignity, something in her simply moved before her mind caught up with it. She crossed the room, feeling every eye that was not on her sister suddenly turned toward her instead, and stopped a respectful distance from the Duke. "I heard you needed a bride," she said quietly. Her voice was not loud, not performed, not practiced. It was simply honest. The Duke turned to look at her properly, perhaps for the first time all evening. His eyes moved over her plain gray dress, her unstyled hair, the complete absence of any of the performance that had filled the room around them. For a long moment he said nothing at all. Then, slowly, one corner of his mouth lifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to unsettle everyone watching. "Maybe," he said, "you." The room, which had already gone quiet once that evening, went quiet again, but differently this time. Seraphine's face went through several emotions at once: confusion, disbelief, and finally something sharp and cold that she quickly hid behind a polite expression. Elira's mother looked as though she might faint, and Elira herself simply stood there, wondering what exactly she had just done. What she had done, it turned out, was change the entire course of her life. The following weeks moved quickly, in the strange, businesslike way that arrangements of convenience tend to move. The Duke's lawyers spoke with the Ashworth family's lawyers. Documents were drawn up. A date was set. There was very little discussion of feelings, of courtship, of any of the things Elira had read about in the novels she loved. This was not a love story. This was a contract, dressed in wedding clothes. Her mother, once she recovered from the shock, tried to claim credit for the match, telling anyone who would listen that she had always known Elira had potential, that quiet girls sometimes surprised you. Elira said nothing to correct her. She had learned long ago that it was easier to let people believe what made them comfortable. Seraphine did not speak to her for nearly 2 weeks. When she finally did, it was not an apology, but a warning, delivered with a tight smile. "Don't get used to it," she said. "Men like that don't stay interested in girls like you." He needed a wife quickly, and you were standing there. That's all it was. Elira told herself that her sister's words did not hurt. She told herself this several times, in fact, which was usually a sign that they had hurt quite a lot. The night before the wedding, Elira could not sleep. She sat by her window long after the candles in the house had been put out, staring at the dark garden below, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She did not know this man. She had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times, never for very long, never about anything that truly mattered. She was about to bind her entire life to a stranger, and she had no way of knowing whether she was walking towards something better than the quiet, overlooked life she had always known, or simply trading one kind of loneliness for another, grander one. It was the old housekeeper who had raised her, more truly than her own mother ever had, who found her sitting there in the dark. The woman said nothing at first, only settled into the chair beside her and took her hand the way she had done since Elira was a small girl crying over some slight nobody else had noticed. "You're frightened," the old woman finally said. "It was not a question. I don't know him," Elira admitted. "What if he never wants to know me either? What if I spend the rest of my life in a grand house, still invisible, just with a finer title attached to my name?" The housekeeper was quiet for a long moment, turning Elira's hand gently in her own. "I have watched you your whole life, child," she said. "I have watched you make yourself small so that others could feel large. I have watched you swallow your own worth because nobody around you thought to feed it. But I have never once seen you shrink because you were told to. You shrank because you chose to, out of kindness, out of patience, out of not wanting to take up space that others seemed to want more badly than you did. That is not the same as being nothing. A girl who chooses to be quiet can just as easily choose to be seen, the moment she decides it's worth the trying." She squeezed Elira's hand. "Whatever happens in that grand cold house, you will not have lost yourself. You will only have moved yourself somewhere new. And for the first time in your life, my dear, nobody there will already have decided who you're allowed to be." Elira thought about those words often in the months that followed, turning them over the way one turns over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, comforting simply to hold. The wedding itself was small and quiet, more legal formality than celebration. Elira wore a simple dress, nothing like the elaborate gown she had once imagined for herself as a little girl, back when she still allowed herself to imagine such things. The Duke wore black, as he seemed to wear every day of his life. They exchanged vows in front of a small handful of witnesses, and when it was done, Elira found herself, quite suddenly, a duchess. She did not feel like one. She felt, if anything, like a girl playing dress-up in a costume far too grand for her, waiting for someone to notice the mistake and send her home. The Thorne estate was enormous, far larger than anything Elira had ever lived in. It was also, she quickly realized, cold, not just in temperature, though the stone halls did seem to hold a permanent chill, but in feeling. The servants moved quietly and quickly, as though trained not to draw attention. There were no flowers in the vases. There were no paintings of smiling faces on the walls. only stern portraits of ancestors who all seemed to share the Duke's unreadable expression. The Duke himself was little better company. In the first weeks of their marriage, Elira saw him perhaps once a day, usually at dinner, where conversation was limited to polite, empty phrases about the weather or the state of the roads. He was not cruel to her, he was not unkind. He was simply absent, even when he was sitting directly across the table from her. She remembered one particular dinner, early in her first week at the estate, when she had tried, gently, to ask him about the portraits lining the great hall, who the stern-faced ancestors were, what stories belonged to them. He had answered in short, clipped sentences, giving her names and dates the way a tutor recites facts to a disinterested student, offering nothing of himself in the telling. When she asked, carefully, whether any of them had been kind, he had simply said, "I wouldn't know," and returned his attention to his plate. She had not tried again for several days after that. The household staff were kind to her, in their own careful way, though it took time for Elira to understand why they moved so quietly, so carefully, as though the house itself demanded silence. It was the head housekeeper of the estate, a stout, no-nonsense woman with graying hair and tired eyes, who finally explained it to her one afternoon while they folded linens together in the sewing room, a task Elira had insisted on helping with, much to the woman's initial surprise. "His Grace lost his mother when he was barely more than a boy," the housekeeper said, not looking up from her folding. "His father followed not 2 years after, though some say it was grief that took him more than illness. The boy was raised after that by uncles and lawyers who cared more for the estate's accounts than for him. He learned early that showing what he wanted only gave people something to take from him, so he stopped showing it. It isn't coldness in his blood, my lady, whatever the town says. It's a boy who was never once allowed the safety of being soft, and grew into a man who forgot how." Elira had said nothing in response, but she had carried those words with her for days afterward, looking at the Duke differently across the dinner table each evening, not as a distant, unreachable man, but as someone who had simply never been given a reason to believe that warmth, once offered, would not be taken advantage of. Elira told herself this was fine. She had, after all, entered this marriage with no expectations of warmth. She had been a convenient solution to a legal problem, nothing more. If anything, she reasoned, it was a relief. She did not have to perform for him. She did not have to compete for his attention the way she had spent her whole life competing, quietly and unsuccessfully, for her family's attention. She could simply exist, unnoticed, as she always had. But something strange began to happen as the weeks passed. She began to notice things about the Duke that did not match his reputation. She noticed that he always left a portion of his meal for the old dog that slept by the kitchen fire, even though he never acknowledged doing it. She noticed that he read late into the night, not the dry legal documents she assumed occupied all his time, but old poetry, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She noticed that when a young servant girl dropped and broke an expensive vase, clearly terrified of punishment, the Duke simply told her to sweep it up and said nothing more about it, though the housekeeper later told Elira, in a hushed voice, that the vase had belonged to his mother. Elira began to wonder if the cold reputation everyone spoke of was less a description of who the Duke was, and more a wall he had built around himself, brick by brick, for reasons she did not yet understand. She began, without entirely meaning to, paying closer attention to him, and she began, in small ways, to make her presence in the house known. She rearranged the flowers that had never been rearranged. She asked the cook, gently, if she might help plan a few meals, having noticed the kitchen seemed to run on habit rather than care. She started spending her afternoons in the estate's neglected garden, coaxing life back into beds that had clearly once been beautiful, before someone stopped tending them. The Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. It was a small household, and a man used to silence cannot help but notice when the silence begins to change shape. One evening, several weeks into their marriage, he found her in the garden long after the sun had set, kneeling in the dirt despite the cold, working by the light of a single lantern to save a rose bush that had been left to tangle and choke itself for years. "You'll ruin your hands," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet garden. Elira, startled, looked up to find him standing at the edge of the path, watching her with an expression she could not quite place. "They were already ruined," she said, holding up hands that were, indeed, covered in dirt and small scratches from the thorns. "I don't think a little more damage will matter much." He was quiet for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he walked closer and crouched down beside her, studying the rose bush she had been working on. "This one belonged to my mother," he said. His voice had changed, gone softer, less guarded than she had ever heard it. "She used to spend hours out here. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to keep it up. It felt easier to let it go wild than to watch it slowly die under my care." End quote. It was the first real thing he had ever told her. Elira sat back on her heels, giving him her full attention, careful not to say anything that might make him retreat back behind his walls. "It's not dying," she said gently. "It's just tangled. Sometimes things look worse than they are, when nobody's had the patience to sort through the mess." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. Something that made her chest feel strangely warm despite the cold night air. "You have more patience than most people I've known," he said. "I've had practice," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. "Being patient is easier when you've spent your whole life waiting for someone to notice you." She expected him to change the subject, the way people usually did when she let something too honest slip out. Instead, he settled further into the dirt beside her, careless of his fine clothes, and asked, "And did they notice you, I mean, before tonight?" Elira considered the question longer than it perhaps required, turning a small thorny branch over in her fingers. "Not really," she admitted. "I don't think it was unkindness, exactly. My sister was simply so bright that everyone's eyes went to her first, and by the time anyone thought to look further, they'd already decided there was nothing more worth seeing. I stopped expecting them to look past her a long time ago. It seemed easier than being disappointed each time they didn't." "That sounds lonely," the Duke said quietly. "It was," Elira said, surprised at how easily the truth came out here, in the dark, with the smell of turned earth around them and no one else listening. "I don't think I realized how lonely, until just now, saying it out loud." He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands work at the tangled branches with a care that suggested he had never before watched anyone tend to something so unremarkable so thoroughly. "I know something of that particular loneliness," he finally said. "Mine looked different. Rooms full of people who wanted something from me, rather than rooms where no one wanted anything at all. But I think, in the end, both kinds leave a person believing they are only as valuable as what they can offer, or as pretty as they can appear. Neither kind teaches a person that they might simply be worth knowing, exactly as they are." Elira looked up at him then, really looked, past the cold reputation and the careful composure, and found something there that startled her with its familiarity. The same guardedness she recognized from her own reflection, the same quiet hope that had gone unspoken for far too long. "Perhaps we could practice," she said softly. "Believing it, together I mean. It seems the sort of thing that might be easier with company." The Duke's mouth curved, not into the sharp, unreadable smirk the whole county whispered about, but into something smaller and far more genuine. "I would like that," he said. "Very much." She had not meant to say something so honest. She braced herself for his usual retreat into silence. Instead, he surprised her. "I noticed you," he said, "that night at the gathering. Before you ever spoke a word. I noticed you standing quietly while everyone else fought for my attention. You were the only person in that entire room who wasn't performing." Elira did not know what to say to that. Nobody had ever told her they had noticed her before she gave them a reason to. She looked down at the rose bush, suddenly very interested in a particularly stubborn tangle of thorns, unwilling to let him see how much his words had affected her. From that night on, something between them began, slowly, to change. It was not sudden. The Duke did not transform overnight into a warm and open man. He still had his silences, his walls, his sharp edges that occasionally emerged when he was tired or troubled. But he began seeking Elira out in small ways, asking her opinion on estate matters he had never asked anyone's opinion on before, walking with her in the garden in the evenings, sitting with her by the fire even when neither of them spoke, simply existing in the same quiet space together. Elira found herself, for the first time in her life, looking forward to being seen, not by a crowd, not by strangers at a ball, but by one person who had somehow, in the middle of a marriage built on necessity, begun to actually pay attention to her. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark, by careful, patient exploration. She learned that his coldness toward the world had grown out of years of people wanting things from him, his title, his money, his name, and very few people ever wanting simply him. She learned that his parents had died when he was young, leaving him to grow up quickly, surrounded by advisors and relatives who saw him more as an investment than a child. She learned that the sharp reputation he carried through society was, in many ways, a shield he had built to protect a heart that had been bruised too many times to trust easily. And he, in turn, learned things about her. He learned about the years of being overlooked in her own family, the quiet ache of always standing in someone else's shadow, the particular loneliness of being present in a room and still somehow invisible. He learned that she loved books, not because she was trying to escape her life, but because books were the only place where she had ever felt like the most important thing on the page. He learned that her patience with tangled, neglected things, gardens, servants who were afraid to speak, even him, came from a lifetime of wishing someone had shown patience with her. Their marriage, which had begun as a legal arrangement between two strangers, slowly became something else entirely. It became, in small and quiet ways, a friendship. And then, in ways neither of them fully admitted out loud, it began to become something more. Word of this change reached beyond the walls of the Thorne estate, as such things always do in small, gossip-hungry towns, and it reached, eventually, the ears of Seraphine. Seraphine had spent the months since the wedding nursing a wound she refused to fully acknowledge, even to herself. She told herself, and everyone who would listen, that she had never truly wanted the Duke, that his coldness had simply not been worth the trouble of marrying, that she had dodged a difficult fate. But underneath these stories, she told herself, there was something rawer and less comfortable, the simple, uncomfortable fact that for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her sister over her, and she did not know what to do with that. When an invitation arrived for a social gathering that both the Duke and Duchess would be attending, Seraphine made sure her family accepted immediately. The evening of the gathering, Elira dressed with more care than she usually did, not out of vanity, but because she had, slowly, begun to feel a bit more comfortable in her own presence, a bit more willing to take up space in a room. When she arrived on the Duke's arm, several heads turned, not toward Seraphine this time, but toward the quiet Ashworth sister who had somehow become a duchess, and who seemed, against everyone's expectations, to be genuinely happy. Seraphine watched from across the room, her smile fixed carefully in place, as the Duke leaned down to say something quiet to Elira that made her laugh. An actual, unguarded laugh, the kind Elira had rarely allowed herself in front of others. It was a small moment, barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it. But Seraphine was looking for it, and it struck her harder than she expected. She made her way across the room, weaving between guests with practiced grace, until she reached the Duke's side. "Your Grace," she said, offering her best smile, the one that had never once failed her. "I don't believe we've had a proper conversation since the wedding. I do hope married life suits you." The Duke's expression, which had been warm and open while speaking with Elira, cooled noticeably, though his manners remained perfectly polite. "It suits me very well," he said simply, and then, after a brief pause that felt deliberately pointed, he added, "My wife has a way of making a house feel like a home. I find I'm rather grateful for it." The words were simple, but they landed exactly where Seraphine's own words had once landed on him, quiet, precise, and impossible to argue with. Seraphine's smile faltered, just for a moment, before she recovered it. "How lovely," she said, her voice a touch too bright. "I always did think Elira had hidden depths. It's nice to see someone finally take the time to notice them." There was an edge to the words, a small cruelty dressed up as a compliment, the kind of thing Elira had heard from her sister her whole life, and had learned to absorb without reaction. But this time, before Elira could respond, the Duke spoke first. "I did notice," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made several nearby guests go quiet, straining to listen without appearing to. "I noticed the moment she stepped forward in a room full of people performing for my attention, and spoke to me honestly instead. I have met a great many women in my life who wanted to be seen. Lady Seraphine, your sister is the only one who never once asked me to see her. She simply was herself, and let me choose whether I wanted to notice. I did. I have never once regretted it." The room, which had been listening with polite pretend disinterest, could not fully hide its reaction to such a direct statement from a man famous for saying almost nothing at all. Seraphine, for the first time in her life, found herself without a clever response. She offered a stiff, small curtsy and excused herself, disappearing into the crowd, her carefully maintained composure finally, quietly, cracking. A few guests nearby exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether they had just witnessed something scandalous or something quietly beautiful. Elira felt her own cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being defended so openly, so completely, in front of people who had spent her whole life looking straight past her. She reached for the Duke's arm, not out of a need to be rescued, but simply because she wanted, in that moment, to be close to the one person in the room who had always seen her clearly. Elira watched her sister go, and felt, to her own surprise, not triumph, but something closer to sadness. She understood, in that moment, that Seraphine's cruelty had never really been about her. It had been about a girl who had spent her whole life being told her worth was tied entirely to how much attention she could command, and who did not know who she was without that attention. Elira, who had spent years learning to exist quietly without it, found she had more understanding for her sister than resentment. Later that night, on the carriage ride home, the Duke was quiet for a long while, watching Elira in the dim light, with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was working up the courage to say something honest. "I meant what I said tonight," he finally told her, "every word of it." Elira looked at him, feeling the same warmth in her chest that had first surprised her in the garden all those months ago. "I know," she said softly. "You don't say things you don't mean. That's one of the first things I learned about you." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his fingers, usually so controlled and careful, holding hers with something that felt almost like relief, as though he had been wanting to do it for a long time and had only just given himself permission. "When I agreed to this marriage," he said quietly, "I told myself it was simply a solution to a problem. A contract. Nothing more. I did not expect—" He paused, searching for words that did not come easily to him. "I did not expect to find someone who made the house feel less like a place I was surviving in and more like a place I wanted to return to. I did not expect to find someone who made me want to be a better man, simply by being honest with me." Elira felt her eyes grow warm, though she blinked the feeling back, unwilling to let something as small as tears interrupt this moment. "I didn't expect it either," she admitted. "I spent my whole life believing I was the kind of person people overlooked. I told myself I was fine with that. It was easier than hoping for something else and being disappointed." "You are not overlooked," the Duke said, his voice firm in a way that left no room for doubt. "Not by me, not ever again." It was not, perhaps, the kind of grand romantic declaration found in the novels Elira had read as a girl, full of flowery language and dramatic gestures. It was simpler than that, quieter than that. But it meant more to her than any of those stories ever had, because it was true, and because it came from a man who did not waste words he did not mean. Not long after that evening, a visitor arrived at the estate, whose presence unsettled the fragile new warmth Elira had begun to feel in her marriage. He was a distant cousin of the Duke's, the very man who stood to inherit the family estate had the marriage not taken place in time. He arrived under the polite excuse of offering his congratulations, though his smile, Elira noticed immediately, did not reach his eyes. He was charming in the practiced way that made her instinctively cautious, complimenting the house, complimenting her, asking careful questions about how she and the Duke had come to marry so quickly. Over dinner, He spoke lightly of the family's legal troubles, mentioning, as though in passing, that arrangements made in haste for the sake of inheritance were sometimes just as easily undone once the danger had passed. Marriages of convenience rarely need to last much beyond their convenience, he said, swirling the wine in his glass with an easy smile. Once the estate is secure, I imagine a man in my cousin's position might feel considerably less urgency about the whole arrangement. Elira said nothing at the table, keeping her expression carefully neutral, but the words lodged themselves somewhere deep and uncomfortable inside her, in the same old place where a lifetime of feeling temporary and replaceable already lived. She told herself the cousin was simply bitter, simply trying to plant doubt because he had lost his claim to the estate. But telling herself this did not make the doubt disappear. The doubt grew worse a few nights later, when Elira, unable to sleep, passed by the Duke's study and overheard him speaking with his lawyer through the partly open door. She had not meant to listen, but she caught fragments of the conversation before she could make herself walk away. Talk of the inheritance now being fully secured, talk of the marriage having served its purpose, talk of what obligations, if any, remained once the legal matter was settled. She heard the lawyer ask, quite directly, whether the Duke intended for the marriage to continue as it was, or whether he wished to discuss other arrangements now that the estate was no longer at risk. She did not stay to hear the answer. She turned and walked quickly back to her room, her heart pounding, the old familiar voice in her head whispering that she had been foolish to believe, even for a moment, that she had become something more to him than a convenient solution to a legal problem. She thought of her sister's warning all those months ago. Men like that don't stay interested in girls like you. For the next several days, Elira quietly began to withdraw, the way she had learned to withdraw her whole life, whenever she sensed she was no longer wanted somewhere. She spent less time in the garden, less time waiting for him by the fire in the evenings. She told herself she was simply preparing, gently and without fuss, to make things easier for him, to offer him a way out before he had to find the courage to ask for one himself. She began, quietly, to consider what it would mean to return to her family home, to slip back into the quiet, overlooked life she had always known, except now with the added ache of having briefly believed it could be different. The Duke noticed the change in her almost immediately. He was not a man easily fooled by careful composure, having spent a lifetime perfecting his own. He found her one evening in the garden, sitting near the rosebush she had spent months coaxing back to health, her hands still, her eyes distant. "You've been avoiding me," he said, not unkindly, though there was a tightness in his voice she had not heard in some time. "I didn't want to make things difficult," Elira said carefully, choosing her words the way she had learned to choose them her whole life, offering him the exit before he had to ask for it. "I know the estate is secure now. I know the reason for our marriage no longer stands quite as urgently as it once did. If you wish to discuss other arrangements, I would understand. I would not make it difficult for you." For a moment, the Duke simply stared at her, and something in his expression that Elira had never seen before flickered across his face. Not anger, but something closer to fear. "Other arrangements," he repeated slowly, as though tasting the strangeness of the words. "You believe I want to be rid of you." "I overheard you," she admitted quietly, unable to look at him directly. "With your lawyer, discussing what obligations remained now that the estate was secure." Understanding dawned slowly across his face, followed quickly by something that looked almost like desperation. "That conversation was about my cousin," he said, "about making certain the estate could never again be threatened by a deadline or a will written by a man long dead. It was about protecting our future, Elira, not ending it. I was arranging for the inheritance to be settled permanently in both our names, so that no cousin, no lawyer, no piece of paper could ever again dictate the terms of my life or yours." He crossed the small distance between them and knelt beside her, taking her still hands in his composure, usually so carefully guarded, entirely gone. "I have spent my whole life being frightened of very little, because I made certain, long ago, never to want anything badly enough that losing it could hurt me. And then you arrived and ruined that careful arrangement entirely, and I found myself, for the first time since I was a boy, genuinely afraid, not of losing an estate or a title, but of losing you. Watching you pull away this past week has frightened me more than any lawyer's letter ever could. Elira felt something in her chest loosen, some old, tightly wound fear finally beginning to unravel. My sister told me men like you don't stay interested in girls like me, she admitted quietly. I think some part of me has been waiting, this whole time, for you to prove her right. Your sister, the Duke said, with the faintest, almost tender trace of his old sharpness, was wrong about a great many things. She was wrong about that most of all. He lifted her hands and pressed them, gently, to his chest, where she could feel his heart beating quickly beneath her palms. I am not interested in you, the way I might be interested in a fine horse, or a well-managed estate, Elira. I have come, somehow, without ever quite meaning to love you. Quietly, the way you do most things, but completely. It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, and it settled into the space between them like something solid and real, something that could not easily be taken back. Elira felt tears rise, unbidden, and did not try to stop them this time. I love you too, she said softly. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. They sat together in the garden a long while after that, saying very little, needing to say very little, the old fear that had driven Elira to prepare her own quiet departure, finally settling into something steadier and far more certain. The cousin, when he heard of the arrangement the Duke had made to secure the inheritance permanently, left the estate within the week and was not invited back. Elira never spoke to him again, though she found, to her surprise, that she felt no anger toward him. He had simply given voice to a fear she had already been carrying long before he arrived, planted in soil that had been prepared for it years before he ever spoke a word. It was not his doubt that had nearly undone her. It was her own, grown old and familiar from a lifetime of practice. In the months that followed, their marriage continued to grow into something neither of them had expected when they first stood before witnesses and exchanged vows born of necessity rather than love. The cold reputation that had once followed the Duke everywhere began, slowly, to soften, not because he had changed into an entirely different person, but because the people around him began to see the parts of himself he had always kept hidden, the parts that Elira had found in the garden that first quiet evening. Elira, too, changed, though perhaps the better word is that she simply grew into herself, into the person she might have always been if someone had given her the chance to be seen. She still preferred quiet evenings to grand parties, still found more comfort in books and gardens than in crowded ballrooms. But she no longer shrank when she entered a room. She no longer assumed her presence was an inconvenience to be minimized. She had learned, slowly and patiently, the way she had once coaxed life back into a tangled and neglected rosebush, that she had always been worth noticing. She had simply needed someone willing to look closely enough to see it. As for Seraphine, something quiet shifted in her as well, though it took much longer and was much harder won. In the months after that gathering, she found herself for the first time genuinely reflecting on the way she had always measured her worth by the attention of others, and the way this had led her to treat her own sister, the one person who had never once competed with her, who had simply existed quietly in the background of Seraphine's brighter, louder life. It was not an easy realization to sit with, but slowly, awkwardly, she began to try. A small note here, a quiet visit there, an admission, offered stiffly but sincerely, that she had not always been fair, and that she was sorry. Elira, who had never learned how to hold on to anger the way some people do, forgave her sister more easily than Seraphine perhaps expected, not because the old hurts had never mattered, but because Elira understood, better than most, what it felt like to build your entire sense of self around something as fragile as other people's attention. She did not forget the years of being overlooked, but she chose, in the life she was building now, not to carry that weight forward with her. The Thorne estate, once cold and quiet and full of untouched rooms, slowly became a home in every sense of the word. Flowers filled the vases. The garden bloomed again, tangled roses coaxed back into order by patient hands. The old dog by the kitchen fire grew fat and happy on scraps that were no longer given in secret, but openly. With a small smile, the Duke no longer bothered to hide. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done, the Duke and Duchess of Thorn could often be found together in the garden, sitting side by side in comfortable silence, two people who had once believed themselves unlikely to ever be truly seen by anyone, now seen entirely, completely, by each other. Elira sometimes thought back to that night at the gathering, to the quiet, almost accidental courage that had made her step forward and speak 5 simple words to a man she barely knew. She had not planned to change her entire life that evening. She had simply refused, in one small moment, to remain invisible any longer. It had been enough. It had been, in the end, everything. Seraphine's visits to the estate became, over time, a quiet and steady part of Elira's new life. They did not become the kind of sisters who shared every secret or finished each other's sentences, and Elira suspected they never would. Too many years of a very different pattern lay behind them for that kind of closeness to arrive easily. But something gentler grew in its place. Seraphine began to ask Elira's opinion on small things, tentatively at first, as though testing whether her sister's thoughts were worth the asking. Elira began to offer them, tentatively at first as well, as though testing whether they would be heard. Slowly, carefully, 2 sisters who had spent their whole lives standing in uneven light began to find a way of standing beside each other instead. Elira's mother, too, adjusted in her own slow, imperfect way. She never fully stopped favoring Seraphine, old habits worn too deep to disappear entirely, but she began, in her letters to the estate, to ask after Elira's own happiness rather than simply after the Duke's health and the state of his fortune. It was not the attention Elira had once longed for as a girl, not the warm, unconditional kind she had watched her mother offer Seraphine so easily, but it was something, offered honestly, and Elira had learned by then not to dismiss small, honest things simply because they had arrived later than she once wished they would. The Duke, for his part, grew easier in the world as the years passed, though he never became the kind of man who filled a room with easy laughter the way Seraphine once had. He remained careful, measured, prone to long silences that Elira had learned to read like familiar weather. But those who had known him before his marriage remarked, quietly and often, on how different he seemed, a little less sharp at the edges, a little more willing to be found in a garden instead of a study, a little more likely to be seen smiling at something his wife had said across a dinner table that had once known only silence. Their household, once known throughout the county for its coldness, slowly became known for something else entirely, a quiet warmth that visitors could not quite name but always seemed to feel the moment they walked through the door. Children who came with their parents to estate gatherings were drawn, without quite knowing why, to the old dog by the kitchen fire and the Duchess who always seemed to have a few minutes to answer their questions, however small. Servants who had once moved through the halls in careful, practiced silence found themselves, over time, speaking a little more freely, laughing a little more often, no longer quite so afraid that warmth, once shown, would be punished. Elira never forgot the years of being overlooked. She did not think she ever fully would, the way certain childhood wounds simply become part of the shape of a person, rather than fading away entirely. But she stopped letting those years define what she believed she deserved. She had learned, slowly, patiently, the way she had learned most things worth learning, that being quiet was not the same as being unworthy of notice, and that the right person, given enough time and enough honesty, would always eventually see clearly what had been there all along. Years later, when people in town told the story of the cold Duke and the forgotten sister, they often got the details wrong. Some said she had been bold and daring from the start. Others said the Duke had fallen for her at first glance, the moment she walked into the room. But those who knew the truth, the Duke and Duchess themselves, and the small circle of people who had watched the story unfold, knew it had never been about boldness or love at first sight. It had been about a quiet girl who had spent her whole life waiting to be noticed, finally deciding to notice herself, and a guarded man who had spent his whole life expecting nothing genuine from anyone, finally choosing to believe that something genuine might, after all, be standing right in front of him. Neither of them had expected a contract born of necessity to become a life built on something so much more lasting, but that, in the end, was exactly what it became. Not a fairy tale of love at first sight, but something steadier, something earned slowly, patiently, the way a neglected garden is coaxed back to life, not all at once, but bloom by bloom, until one day you look around and realize the whole thing has grown into something beautiful, without you quite noticing the moment it happened. And Elira, once the forgotten sister, once the girl nobody thought to look at twice, became in the end the one person the coldest man in the county could never look away from.